Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Steve Leibowitz. This week, the nation got its hopes up as a humanitarian mediated deal appeared to be in the offing that would include a phased release of Israeli hostages held in Gaza for the past 214 days. It would have included an extended pause in fighting and a further delay in the Rafah operation. We woke up to the news today that the Hamas agreement to a changed hostage deal did not meet Israeli standards and that IDF tanks had rolled into Rafah. Our war has attracted a great deal of attention, none of it good. 7 months of war and growing demands for a ceasefire are even playing out on the college campuses across the U.S. and Western Europe. Well, joining us today to discuss are two veteran and successful immigrants. Ari Harrow is the former chief of staff for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and former Knesset member Alon Tal from Minister Benny Gantz's Blue and White joins us from California. Ari, let me start with you. I've covered the war nearly every day for 214 days. The most often used phrase from the Prime Minister is nitzachon muchlat, total victory. In the past 4 months, there's been virtually no movement toward defeating the remaining Hamas brigades. Now the Rafah operation is finally underway. Will that bring us closer to total victory?
So there's been two pillars to this war as far as they've been declared and dictated by the war cabinet. Number one is to bring home the hostages, and number two is to dismantle the capabilities of Hamas as both a political and terror entity so that Israel doesn't have to face that and face the possibility of another October 7th at any time in the future. And that goal can only be achieved by continuing the offensive against Hamas, by going into Rafah and dealing with their capabilities wherever else they still exist within Gaza. At the same time, and as I started by saying, this war cannot be complete victory without bringing home the hostages. So it is a very difficult dilemma that the leadership of Israel faces. Ultimately, moving on one where you are afraid that you may jeopardize the other is challenging, but there cannot be a total victory without achieving both.
All right, Alon, let me turn to you. War Cabinet Minister Gantz is still in the government with Netanyahu. He too says he favors a Rafah operation. The vote in the War Cabinet was unanimous. Gantz strongly favors a hostage deal, but not at any cost. Yet there's an image that there are significant policy differences between the two. What might those be at this point?
Well, I think that we all recognize that ultimately we have weakened the Hamas dramatically, but many of us have reached the conclusion that the only way to completely take the Hamas out of the picture as a force in the region is to replace it with an alternative entity. An improved Palestinian Authority, some sort of a coalition with moderate Arab states, whatever your vision might be. The trouble is that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, because of his extremist partners in his coalition, is unable to articulate any kind of ultimate alternative regime. And I think there'd be a vast majority of Israelis who agree that in the long term, staying in Gaza as an occupying force is not sustainable. Certainly in the international realm, it would be untenable. And Israel's status, which is already plummeted to new lows, would be even more of a pariah, and the boycotts would be unbearable economically. So I think what we need from Netanyahu is a little bit more of a, how should I put it, a thimble full of vision with regarding a ultimate long-term day-after solution. Gantz and Eisenkot surely have one, but because of the extremist position of his partners, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and even people in his own Likud party, we have a prime minister who's basically been paralyzed. And what the lesson of the last few months, in my mind, is that paralysis and stagnation is disastrous in the diplomatic front. I'm here in the United States on campuses, meeting with people. Last week I had a to our engagement with the former Palestinian Authority Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad. And the problem is it's impossible to defend an Israeli government that is unable, even at this late stage, to come with any kind of long-term diplomatic vision. So although I think Gantz agrees completely that we have to take out the remaining battalions in Rafah, and we got a reminder just this week when they shelled and killed the Israeli soldiers from Kerem Shalom that we have not limited that military ability when Rafah is still a hot and dangerous area that this must be neutralized. But at the same time, we can't do this final stage in the chess game without knowing what that final solution and resolution will be.
Ari, before we go on, I just wanted to say, I know you from the ball field. You're a terrific athlete, and I know that you woke up this morning with a terrible back ache. I told you just take some aspirins and get out there because I knew you could do it, and thank you for being with us. Over Shabbat, an unnamed senior official, this is for you, Ari, a senior official who has been named by reporters as Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted that it was not the end of the war. He even accepted U.S. praise for the generous offer. Why didn't he wait for an answer from Hamas before giving those statements? Right now, does Netanyahu prefer a Rafah operation to a hostage deal at this moment?
I think that we have to remember, and this touches on what Alon was saying as far as the day after as well. We cannot have a day after when Hamas is still in power. We cannot have a day after where Hamas is going to return to its administration of the Strip, to rebuilding its capabilities, and to going back to killing Israeli civilians. I think that the Prime Minister and those surrounding him, and I'll point out one thing, to Alon as well, and that is that it's not the Prime Minister's coalition. It's a coalition that Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot are part of. They are not external to the government. They are ministers in this government, and they share responsibility with all the elements inside that government. And one thing that is clear, as you stated earlier, Steve, is that everybody from Benny Gantz and Eisenkot on the one hand to the more extreme partners on the other side, all agree that there is no end to this war until Hamas is defeated and there is a different leadership in the Gaza Strip. And therefore, I don't think that Netanyahu is moving away from a hostage deal. I think that he has seen something that we've all seen here in Israel for 7 months now, and that is that Hamas is not a fair party to negotiation. They are not a partner that we can sit down and hammer this out with. They are a partner that has done everything they can to kill their own civilians. They've done everything they can to bring death and destruction to the Gaza Strip. They've done everything they can to continue to kill Israelis and Jews, and they will continue to do that as long as they're around. And I think that ultimately a deal would be welcome by the vast majority of Israelis as long as it stuck to basic guidelines that protect our interests, and most importantly, allow us to finish the job that puts 9 million Israelis in jeopardy.
Alon, I wanted to go back to you in California. We're heading toward Memorial Day and Independence Day. I personally this will be my 50th Independence Day in Israel. I think you and I are about the same on that.
I'll get there soon one day myself.
Usually it's an amazing time of grieving followed by celebration. How do you expect it will be this year? Much of the nation, some of the nation certainly blames the government for the hostage deal falling through. So many people are still out of their homes in the north and the south. What kind of holidays is it going to be?
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message. creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
I think it's going to be a somber and a less than celebratory atmosphere. Every year in the backyard, we always invite about 120, 150 people to sing some of the old Israeli folk songs that we all sort of grew up on, the Zionist liturgy, if you will. And this year, we feel like it would be inappropriate. I have a childhood friend, Keith Siegel, grew up in North Carolina with me, had an aliyah, was participating in my bar mitzvah, and he is still, although his wife has been released, he's still in Gaza, and he and what he represents puts a cloud over us. But I think that the disingenuousness of the Hamas has left us in something of a tizzy. I mean, after all the expectations to hear that the big hostage deal would release 3 hostages in a week, it just seems like the government has done whatever it could. At some point, they had to move forward. So it's a dance because, again, the single most important strategic asset we have in the present war, besides the Israeli unity, which is not quite what it was at the beginning of the war, but the single most important asset we have is the American support. And Rafah, to my mind, has been blown out of proportion. But we have to find a way to move forward carefully, surgically, with as small civilian damage as possible, but to show the Hamas that we are not completely paralyzed by their, chicanery and by their cruelty, which they've shown to their own citizens and to our own as well.
Ari,
So this year's end it will be a sad one.
yeah, Ari, I mean, Independence Day with tens of thousands still out of their homes in the north and in the south, with hostages still held in Gaza. It's going to be kind of hard to celebrate, don't you think? I mean, what is there a message of unity that our leaders can give us right now so that Independence Day will seem more optimistic?
Most definitely, Steve. This is definitely going to be the most challenging Independence Day and Memorial Day that I can recall, and I'm assuming the most difficult since the foundation of the state. As Alon touched upon, we have seen next to the cruelty and ugliness of Hamas, the beauty and the togetherness of the people of Israel, the soldiers that continue to battle. You know, I was down on the border a few days ago with a group of reservists who had finished 2 rounds of duty up in the north. They were home for a week or 2, and then they were called down south to go into Gaza. These are older gentlemen with families, with children, with businesses that have put everything aside, and they come from all walks of life, religious and non-religious, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, left-wing, right-wing, and they were all together with a tremendous sense of unity, of purpose, and moral clarity as to what we are trying to do. And the state of Israel was founded to give us a place where we would feel safe and free as Jews to make those choices and to be diverse in who we are, but united in our goals and our morality. And I think that it's something that we need to keep in mind and remember around these holidays. And that is what will continue to drive us as a people to do what needs to be done and to really send a message to the world that we are the forces of good and we are fighting the forces of evil.
Alon, since you're over in the U.S. and have spent time on the campus, let me ask you this. Between 1969 and 74, I visited Columbia University and other campuses a number of times and witnessed intense protest against the war in Vietnam. With all due respect, what's all the fuss about these campus protests?
Well, I think that the results of the arrests last week in Columbia shed a little bit of light to what's actually happening, that 1/3 of those who were part of the takeover of the administration building and part of the encampments are outside agitators, professional cranks, many with criminal records, who have very radical, anarchistic, or just somewhat extremist perspective and ideology on life. And unfortunately, many of the students who are swept into this thing have no idea about the issues. If you go and talk to them, we have an encampment here at Stanford where I'm teaching, and they couldn't give you the name of a single Palestinian leader. They couldn't show you where Israel or Gaza is on a map.
They don't know which river we're talking about. You know, they don't even know what river to the sea. I know.
So although it's very easy for us to be dismissive at the superficialness of the protesters, their ability to get on the news is certainly impressive. I mean, we sat there for 2 hours glued to the TV as the live CNN covered the thing. I'm hopeful that the tactical mistakes of these extremist protesters will ultimately be their undoing. For example, I'm from North Carolina. At the University of North Carolina, the small, but 40, 50 demonstrators literally took down the American flag and hoisted the Palestinian flag. That's not something you do in North Carolina. And the chancellor of the university came down and returned the American flag. And I don't think their place on the campus will be the same after that kind of activity. So I think it's very different than the what happened in Vietnam. I was not old enough to experience it. From what I understand, first of all, Americans under age 21 were facing an existential challenge about whether they were going to be drafted.
I was facing the draft, and that's why I went to the protests. I'd rather, come here than serve there. But
it is so. I don't think, although I think there's a certain kind of nostalgia that some of these young demonstrators see themselves as some sort of the heirs of that kind of demonstration. The fact that they are identifying with jihadist forces, that they're strengthening the Iranian axis, all these kind of things are starting to come clear to the American public. Of course, there is concern whether this could affect the vote for the Democratic Party in the upcoming election, and I think it's too early to tell that. Certainly, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, which mirrors that in 1968, will be a testing ground. But in the last week, actually, I think that the activities of the police and the single-minded determination of people like the mayor of New York, who stood behind Israel, and the police force, and who did their work very, very carefully, cautiously, and successfully, I think has changed this. And of course, now universities are going on vacation. And so I'm hopeful that this really unfortunate chapter in the American political history and campuses will be behind us.
At least Mayor Daley won't be at this Democratic convention. Ari, Washington does not want this Rafah operation. Our other friends in the world and the UN, the ICC, the campus activists are certainly going to make the coming days for us torturous as the Rafah operation goes on. Is it worth the cost?
It is worth the cost because ultimately the cost of not doing it is Jewish and Israeli lives. We have to remind ourselves, and we have to remind our friends around the world, that the statements made by their leadership, by President Biden and by leaders of our European friends, post October 7th, and for a number of months after that, was very clear that the goal of destroying Hamas was a goal that they shared. Hamas is a terrorist organization and recognized as such in the United States of America, in the European Union. This is a goal that all Western liberal societies had agreed upon in a very public fashion. And therefore, finishing off the job in Rafah, and not just in Rafah, is not only in our interests, it's in the interest of all Western liberal societies. The United States, for various reasons, I think Alon touched on some of them with regard to their domestic political concerns, has taken a little bit of a different stance. But it's very clear to most in Israel that that is them playing politics and not protecting the interests of the state of Israel when it comes to our security and the future of our southern border. We still have the northern border that's going to have to be dealt with in one way or another, whether it's a diplomatic solution or a military solution. So Israel is far from reaching the finish line of what needs to be done. We still have the Iran lurking themselves in the background and some of the other militias in the region. We need to finish off Hamas as first and foremost to protect ourselves and to allow the residents of the South to return to their homes. But secondly, to secure our place in this region. And a point that I've made before in our conversation, Steve, it's not just about Israel protecting itself and its interests. If we want to see the circle of peace, the Abraham Accords, stand the test of the current realities and potentially even expand to Saudi Arabia, then we need to finish the job in Gaza.
If I could just add two things that I often say on campuses. The first is the only thing worse than 32, 33,000, whatever the number is, of Gazans dying. Of course, we know it's actually much lower than that because many of those are terrorists. But the only thing worse than 33,000 Gazans dying is 33,000 Gazans dying for nothing. And the fact that we are presently still in the middle of the process of changing the reality in our southern borders means that we can't let it sit as it is. The second thing that I would like to say when we talk about the world being against us, two dates. First one is October 21st, when the Arab countries convened in Cairo, and the extremist countries called for the breaking of diplomatic relations with Israel and closing airspace and all these kind of measures, returning us perhaps to where we were before the
Alon, just we're our last 30 seconds. Just a few. Sorry to.
Okay, so basically, we have a situation now where the Arab partners in the region are not breaking diplomatic relations with Israel because they, just like Aryeh said, know that we have to finish the job as well.
All right, well, guys, I was actually planning to ask for your message to the people of Israel and the Jews in the diaspora who are quite concerned about Israel's current image and policies and, frankly, its leadership. Could either of you give us just 2 words of encouragement?
This too shall pass. We just need to take a deep breath and be convinced that the Jewish state has a strong ethical basis. This war was a moral war, and we will win, ultimately.
Amen. And thank you both for joining us. It's all the time we have for this evening. Thank you to our guests, Ari Harrow and Alon Tal. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at iltv.tv. Thanks for watching. Let's win the war and bring them home.